Shortly after the attacks of 9/11, the United States decided to arm surveillance drones, turning these eyes in the sky into lethal weapons.
The availability of this sort of technology in which machines can roam the sky without having humans on board who are at risk, it actually enables us to go places that we normally wouldn't go at all.
In the years that followed, an unknown number of lives have been taken by these armed drones, and the lives of countless bystanders have been lost as well.
We put eyes in the sky, and then we make decisions about who's going to live or die, irrespective of really, at times, what are the collateral consequences, or for that matter, what impact it may have on we as Americans.
And so because of that, we've seen armed conflict situations and lethal force operations spread in a way and go to areas where we might not otherwise engage militarily, and we may not otherwise choose to engage in lethal force without the use of this technology.
For a warrior who values courage and honor, this type of warfare can be a betrayal. It can be a betrayal of these core values.
In this film, we will join with some of America's top faith leaders to examine the morality of drone warfare. Both in the course of war and outside of wartime conditions, drone technology is not particularly new. Remotely piloted vehicles have been around for years.
The U.S. and Great Britain and others have been working on this since the First and Second World Wars. And they used that technology then for radio signal jamming. They used it for target practice. And they were less successful in using them in the lethal frame, which is what we're talking about today. Drones were then later armed. Israel used them successfully for intelligence gatherings, reconnaissance, surveillance, and then used them in 1980 in their war against Syria. Iran used them in their war in the 1980s against Iraq. So arming these drones that prior to that had been used for surveillance purposes. And the U.S. took existing technologies, so they took Predator and Reaper drone planes that were used for intelligence and surveillance and armed them with off-the-shelf missile technology that they had. So they basically paired Hellfire missiles to Reaper and Predator drones. And that's the lethal drone technology that the U.S. has today.
The precedents being set by our use of UAVs are very frightening to contemplate. We have 86 countries in the world right now who have UAV technology. We have 19 countries that have lethal UAV technology and the capability to use it. We have 9 countries who have used it, and they include the United States, the United Kingdom, Nigeria, Iraq, Iran, and another couple of countries. I often say this to my American colleagues who act like they're gleeful about our possession of lethal drones. Wait until you see one come down on Times Square, because it's inevitable it will happen. There is not a single technology of warfare in the history of warfare which hasn't been adopted and used by others and ultimately used against the hegemon itself. Whether that hegemon be Rome, Assyria, Britain, or whatever empire has used it in the past. It will happen.
The community has always it's part of a religious tradition that you put your heads together, use every diplomatic means to first figure out, have all other means been depleted? And only if all other means have been depleted can you then go on the next step, that now should we go to war. And even that has to be, put in context. Is this war really to protect the country or to protect the faith community? For example, if it happens to be particularly just the Sikh faith community in a place where they have to be defended, and is it about your honor? Is it something terrible that's going to happen and there's no other means? Then you take that next step.
Today, theologians, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, all of them, when they talk about war, they talk about the limits of war. They talk about the morality and the ethics of war. We as Muslims, when we go through our scripture, Quran, and the model of the Prophet, we see that these discussions have their origin in that time. And later, after the Crusades and after other experiments that the Christians did, this was the good thing that ultimately they also adopted and evolved ethics of war, which is no different from what Islam teaches.
The Catholic Church has really wrestled with the question of the use of force or the questions of war and peace from the very beginning, right? The Church in its earliest time, relied heavily on the nonviolence tradition flowing directly from the gospel, from Jesus' own example of turn the other cheek. But as the Church, as Christianity grew and members of the Church took on the responsibility to protect, the Church then developed a teaching on the just use of force, the use of force to protect.
The Church of the Brethren is one of the historic peace churches, so along with the Mennonites and Quakers, has had the questions of peace, particularly in relation to violence in the military, at if not the core of our identity, at least the core of how people identify us, and one of the main things that we have wrestled with and thought about for the years since we began. Along with these other groups, we emerged out of a context that was not favorable towards religious differences. And so out of this seeking to follow the teachings and example of Jesus, particularly when we hear Jesus saying, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, but also their experience of being persecuted, the question of violence and particularly participation in this violence was very core to their identity.
The Talmud says broadly, someone who gets up, if someone is going to kill you, you can get up earlier and kill him. Okay, it's kind of it's a Talmudic phrase. For instance, it's usually referring to individuals in that sense, because ultimately in our Jewish tradition, every life is precious. Every life is created in the image of God. Everyone has a certain holiness about him, and so to say that one life is more valuable than another life is deeply offensive to Jewish values.
The approach to drones and drone warfare, or today militarized policing, robotic policing, surveillance, is often a defensive, that we should not do this. But one of the things that I think is important for people to do is proactive peacemaking. And in the United Church of Christ 30 years ago, we developed a paradigm that we call just peace. This is between, if you can imagine a continuum. Imagine a continuum where pacifism is here and just war is here. Pacifism is the principled opposition to the use of any violence. Just war is under what conditions can we justly use force. Now let's pretend that crusade is over here, and there's a lot of overlap in religious wars with crusade. But in the middle, there is a space where we say, we're not just opposed to using violence, we're going to proactively create the conditions that will make more peace and less violence. So that is the just peace paradigm.
at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, we've had a longstanding message that war is not the answer. And we certainly believe that war is not the answer. But I think the question is, how does that extend itself into military conflict? And specifically, the new ways that our country and other countries are engaging in military conflict that is still killing people and disregarding human life.
Lethal drones are unmanned aerial vehicles that are used to target individuals who are suspected of being terrorists in locations that are usually very far flung away from where we would normally put U.S. armed forces on the ground. In terms of the number of civilian deaths, the numbers vary very widely depending upon the source of the information. The U.S. government, for example, says that only between 61 to 116 people have been killed, but the Bureau of Independent Investigative Journalists believe that the number is significantly higher.
Probably the best number was given unintentionally in 2013 by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina. And he revealed that there had been over 4,700 deaths from drone strikes.
Chris Ontal is a Unitarian Universalist minister and a former Army chaplain who worked with drone pilots on the front lines of this technology.
We repudiate covert wars and the unnecessary targeting of civilians or putting civilians at risk and the disproportionate use of force. And in all of those areas, we have taken a public stand in protest to the U.S. government's use of drone warfare.
These drones are having a devastating effect on communities. Innocent people are being killed, and that's why we have also called for a moratorium on the use of drones.
It's secret, it's extra legal, it separates the citizens of this country, including we evangelicals, from our own leaders because we don't know what's going on, and only occasionally we hear about it when there are civilian casualties, which is inherent in drone warfare. Civilian deaths.
The introduction of these lethal technologies, and I want to especially emphasize lethal technologies, robots, drones, surveillance that take the human out of it, more and more accelerate lethal violence. They are accelerants.
Armed drones are expanding warfare. Empirically, we know this to be true. The United States is using lethal drones in places where we are not at war, like Somalia, Libya, Yemen, Pakistan, and in places where we otherwise would not be engaged in violence. Lethal drones are being used outside of war zones, and that expands the killing fields to places where we would otherwise not send boots on the ground. There is zero chance that the U.S. President or the U.S. Congress would authorize sending in troops on the ground to invade Pakistan, to engage in boots on the ground in Somalia, in Yemen, in Libya. But having the ability to send remotely piloted vehicles to those areas to drop Hellfire missiles without putting our own U.S. soldiers in harm's way is what makes possible expansion of warfare to those geographic areas.
What we're told about drones being discriminate, in fact, there are a great number of innocent people who are killed. When I was serving in Afghanistan as a chaplain, there was an operation called Haymaker that involved primarily targeting what the military called high-value targets with drones. And by the military's own analysis, 219 people were killed in Operation Haymaker, and only 35 of them were the intended targets. So 9 out of the 10 people killed were not the intended targets. So that's just one example of how this type of warfare does not meet the criteria of discrimination.
There are practices of just war, and one of those is imminent danger. And the documents that the Obama administration has generated in the previous administration to justify the use of drones has been imminent threat. That threat is imminent, therefore we are justified in using a lethal drone. But in practice, that has not routinely been the case.
Drones by themselves are just another weapon. So it's not the drone itself, it's the humans who are making decisions to use those drones. Now you can use a drone during war, and it could be very legitimate. And other places, drones are being used to literally, you're like a carte blanche license to assassinate an individual who's perceived to be a terrorist threat or a threat in general, and that too in someone else's sovereign country. And I think that is the moral dilemma people are discussing and saying, well, if the roles are reversed, and if someone else from some other foreign country struck an American in America with a drone, how would we feel?
Moral norms around the use of force are precisely designed to limit the amount of force used in the world, and precisely designed to promote use of nonviolence tools first. And I think the danger is we're on a slope where the use of force becomes easier and cheaper. And it's damaging to the communities that experience the terror of strikes occurring in civilian areas. It is damaging to the operators of drones who are making life and death decisions and then going home to their families. And because the tool is so easy to use, it's a risk for policymakers that they may slip into the use of force prematurely because this tool is so readily available and so relatively inexpensive to deploy.
I think for Friends, there are several levels of concern about the use of lethal drones. One is that it is a form of extrajudicial killing, that it's not clear who is making the decision about who will be a target of lethal drones. Another is that despite what the administration and what we've heard is the best effort to have precise targeting, there are civilian casualties that have been much more than, we don't even know for sure how many, because we don't get accurate reports of what's happened, but the civilian casualties is a big issue. I think the third level of concern for us is the kind of existential threat that exists when drones are circling overhead. We've certainly heard reports from Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia and other places where the United States has had lethal drones, that just the existence of these drones provides a kind of stress that is hard to imagine living with. And then there's the concern for the use of, the concern about the people who are actually operating the drones, and that there is a remote kind of killing to what they're doing that is problematic.
There's always going to be psychological harm when we're involved in the dirty business of killing people. The military has tried to reduce that psychological harm through training. Training that dehumanizes the people that we're killing, that produces what we could call a moral disengagement or rationalizing the killing. But that in and of itself is psychologically harmful. And as a chaplain and as a minister, I would say that if we're going to be involved in the business of killing people, then it ought to hurt.
I've heard people say the impact that it's had on them personally and psychologically. I think one of the things that we don't hear in the United States enough is the impact that war has on people who are actually doing the fighting. We don't hear enough about the impact that war has on families.
If the purpose is security and using drones gets rid of one person that may in fact be some way related to terrorism, does that actually create greater security? And for me as someone from a peace church, that sort of question is, I would say, is quite uncomfortable.
I mean, we have been watching and reading the reports of different agencies. It has never been one single person who has been killed along with him or along with her. You have many other people who are unintentionally targets of death and destruction. So on the one hand, it is theologically, it violates that. The whole idea of targeting extremists is a wonderful idea. But the problem is that it does not kill that ideology, that subversive interpretation of Islam. Third is, it generates so much of mistrust and so much of distrust about America itself. When you have seen that, particularly in Pakistan or in Yemen, it has generated so much of ill will and hate against America.
If you have to, as a last resort, use a drone technology, what's the probability of success? And using drones outside of war zones, where you have whole civilian populations that are then terrorized by the use of drones, going after signature strikes or something on terror targets and so forth, actually could be quite counterproductive. It could raise up the very extremism that the strikes are meant to tap down. So you got to ask bigger questions. It's not just a question of technology. There are moral questions to be asked regarding the use of drones.
Now, signature strikes mean that there is a pattern of activity that is identified as potentially dangerous. There's no particular individual. And remember, these are not people who have been convicted of any crime. They have not been tried in any court, but there are activities that are identified by a computer program, and the individuals engaging in that suspect activity are fired upon by the drone. These are very controversial, and I would argue completely immoral, uses of force.
Most egregiously, some people are targeted simply because of where they are and how old they are. In areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan, any male between the ages of 20 and 40 who are found in certain areas and who are killed by a drone strike are automatically labeled combatants. I think in one case there was a cleric who was trying to educate an extremist on how his actions were against the tenets of Islam. Nonetheless, these people were killed.
Part of the difficulty with drones is they're very inexpensive, and you place none of your own combat troops at risk in the use of drones, and so there's a fear, will the use of drones become a first resort rather than a last resort to resolve a conflict or to get at the use of drones? The church has very serious questions about the moral questions about the use of drones outside zones of active conflict, active war. Civilians in a rural village somewhere in the world who are not at war should not expect to be collateral damage in a drone strike. We need to erect some legal barriers to the deployment of drones. Otherwise, it'll be sort of like the Wild West in terms of the nations of the world deploying drones. How would we feel if drones get deployed against armed drones get deployed against our people and our interests around the world? That and we're not far away from that. There are a lot of nations that are deploying drones for all kinds of purposes, and we need to be sure that there's a strong international framework governing the use of drones so that it doesn't become the Wild West, it doesn't spiral out of control.
The technology is a temptation to see there can be a simple, easy, and cheap way to police our communities or to police the world. That's a fantasy. That's a myth. What these technologies, and we've had them now for quite a while, what they cause is blowback. What they cause is increased terrorism. What they cause is a breakdown in community relations. They break down civil rights. And finally, they do not solve problems. They are themselves part of the problem.